I would now like to introduce our presenter. Catherine is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University and a visiting scholar in the Division of Mammals at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Catherine's doctoral research, which is funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, focuses on the processes of development implementing landscape-level natural resource conservation. Welcome, Catherine.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you guys today. I see on the attendee list that there are many friends out there, so thank you so much for making the time to attend, everybody. Just a bit about myself. I have a background in biology with a focus on ecology and wildlife management, and I chose to become a social scientist because understanding and influencing human attitudes and behaviors can help catalyze conservation of natural resources. My dissertation research, which Mary mentioned, is funded by the Human Dimensions branch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, focuses on how to avoid planning implementation gaps in large landscape conservation through considering the social or human dimensions of landscape conservation planning. So just a bit of an introduction. And to start with, as you all know, a collaborative landscape level approach to natural resource conservation has been increasingly adopted over the past 30 years. Examples of these initiatives include migratory bird joint ventures, which were initiated in the 1980s, NRCS's Natural Resource Conservation Services Landscape Conservation Initiatives, their Working Lands for Wildlife initiatives, and of course the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives, one of which is hosting me today, which is funded through the Department of the Interior. The collaborative landscape conservation model is partnership-based and relies on a decentralized co-governance model where decision-making power is shared amongst a variety of organizations and agencies. Despite its potential advantages, the collaborative landscape conservation model faces inherent challenges. Primary amongst these is the question of how to ensure ecosystem-wide goals for conservation will be adopted into local management plans and then implemented through local management actions, fundamentally in aggregate achieving landscape conservation goals. Within the United States, as in most parts of the world, ecoregions, or ecologically connected landscapes, contain complex, heterogeneous mosaics of land use and ownership. Developing socio-politically feasible, achievable landscape conservation goals requires a landscape planning process that includes a diversity of actors from different professional sectors who operate at multiple geographic and institutional levels. Particularly important to engage in landscape conservation planning are local stakeholders. This is because landscape conservation planning, depicted here by the large adaptive planning cycle on the top, right here, takes place at a geographic and institutional level distinct from that at which local management plans, depicted by the smaller adaptive management planning cycles down here, are developed and implemented. It is local stakeholders who develop these local management plans, so ensuring their interests and values are represented during decision-making can directly influence whether landscape conservation goals are achieved through local management actions. Just to step back for a moment before we proceed, let's define some terms and concepts. Local stakeholders are organizations, networks, and individuals who operate at the ground level where resource planning, management, and use occur, have vested interest in the management of resources targeted for conservation, and have the power, such as political power, social influence, or control over resource management, to support or impede implementation of conservation promoting management actions. A particularly important local stakeholder group that should be considered and included during landscape conservation planning are potential end users of collaborative landscape conservation planning products, such as spatial analyses, conservation prioritizations, or management recommendations. End users are individuals or representatives of groups, organizations, or agencies that influence, develop, or implement land and resource management plans, and may use collaborative landscape conservation planning products to inform their plan development or management actions. End users are thus the local stakeholder group that in many ways determines whether landscape conservation goals are achieved through local management practices. To further examine what I mean by planning products and to draw on an explicit example, let's look at landscape conservation design. Landscape conservation design is a process, it's a collaborative landscape conservation model used by most landscape conservation cooperatives. And it's a planning process through which there is a production of planning products. These planning products may include common conservation goals and objectives for a landscape, spatial analyses of habitat ranges and species ranges, prioritize areas that should ideally be conserved for wildlife and habitat, and management recommendations. So these planning products are ideally then distributed to end users who ideally incorporate them and adopt them into their local management plans. And in theory, in aggregate, these local management plans, if they're coordinated, can achieve landscape conservation goals. Now, there are a range of benefits associated with local stakeholder participation in collaborative landscape conservation planning. One of the most important is that including these local stakeholders who may be impacted by conservation decisions can promote good environmental governance. By this, I mean a inclusive, fair, transparent, forward-thinking, and legitimate planning process that ultimately results in planning outcomes that are perceived as fair and forward-thinking. Including local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning can also facilitate social learning. Social learning is a process by which people communicate, and through these communications processes, they come to realize other folks' values and needs, and also they can share information about knowledge. So through this social learning process, the developers of landscape conservation plans can enhance the local relevancy of the conservation decisions that are made. Including local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning can also promote awareness of environmental threats that impact entire landscapes and might not be as poignant or easily observed at a more localized level at which these local stakeholders operate and exist. Ultimately, and something that I think is quite interesting, is that including local stakeholders in the landscape conservation planning process can foster a sense of ownership over the planning products. Whatever the conservation goals that are developed, if local stakeholders are involved in their development, they may have a sense of ownership over the planning process and the planning products, and may feel an intensified interest and need to actually implement management plans that support those goals that they feel a part of. So ultimately, this participation by these local stakeholders can really potentially increase the willingness of local stakeholders to adopt planning products into their management planning. Not including local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning can present a number of quite challenging scale discordance issues. And scale discordance is a phenomena where the people who are making a plan might not be the folks that are implementing the plan. And so there's not a coherent overlap between the folks that are conducting and strictly involved in the planning process and those that would be conducting the management planning. And so in worst case scenarios, something that can happen is that you'll face a planning implementation gap where conservation planning products are developed and conservation goals are established, but these goals and products are not incorporated into local management plans and enacted through local management actions as a result of basically their lack of local socio-political feasibility, lack of ownership, lack of interest at the local level. Avoiding these planning implementation gaps is paramount for a variety of reasons. We only have so much funding that can go towards landscape conservation and natural resource conservation, so we want to use that funding as efficiently and effectively as possible. When a group comes together and in many cases voluntarily contributes their time to a planning process, and then the management plans that would support those goals that are created and those planning products that are created, when there's not a implementation that kind of comes to fruition with whatever the objective for the natural resources are, it can really degrade folks' interest in coming to the table in the future. So planning implementation gaps ultimately can really reduce the likelihood that conservation partners would want to come together again in an iterative process, which is really important to the adaptive management cycle. And it really degrades the potential for future partnership development. So it's well understood that collaborative landscape conservation planning can really benefit from inclusion of local stakeholders, and it's actually a primary objective of landscape conservation design and other landscape conservation planning models to include these local stakeholders in the planning process. A problem arises, however, because the folks that are the process sponsors that are leading these collaborative landscape conservation processes and the conservation partners that are normally included in these processes are not always sure about how to work between these geographic and institutional levels and effectively engage local stakeholders in the planning process. So ultimately, there's questions about how, when, and through what mechanisms these local stakeholders can participate. And that's the question that my inquiry and Cornell's inquiry sought to address. Specifically, we sought to understand when, where, and through what mechanisms the values, interests, and needs and knowledge of local stakeholders can be most effectively integrated into landscape conservation planning processes. There are other landscape planning models out there, such as integrated landscape management, that have done a pretty fantastic job of engaging local stakeholders. But the difference there is that a lot of these initiatives are focused on the social aspects. They're not necessarily focused on the ecological aspects of landscape conservation planning. So my dissertation research really sought to understand, within the context of ecologically focused landscape conservation planning, how can we best engage local stakeholders in these planning processes? In order to address these questions, I conducted a multiple stage social science inquiry. First, I conducted a literature review to understand how a broad diversity of landscape conservation initiatives have used social data and local stakeholder engagement to inform their planning processes and to gather lessons and caveats associated with those processes folks have already underwent. I then conducted 40 interviews with the coordinators of 32 collaborative landscape conservation initiatives, and these range from large federally funded programs to by-state programs to even within state programs. And this is a really interesting process because in order to kind of develop the population that I wanted to interview, I developed this large database of all of the landscape conservation initiatives that I could find in the United States. And there are over 500. This is in part because there are so many, landscape is a kind of a malleable term. Basically, it means anything that crosses a jurisdiction, right? But that can be, multiple counties, or it can be multiple countries. And so by speaking with this range of coordinators, I identified how these broad diversity of landscape conservation initiatives use local stakeholders, engage local stakeholders and social data in their planning processes. And this is a fantastic opportunity to kind of really understand the scope and the range of the ways that folks are engaged. I then conducted a multiple case study analysis where I focused on 3 landscape conservation design initiatives throughout the United States in distinct ecological regions and distinct socio-political regions in order to understand how they were, within these landscape conservation designs, engaging local stakeholders in the planning process. And I specifically focused on end users. And you can see on the right here, this is just an example of the range of the organizational affiliations of the end users I spoke with. So I spoke with 55 members of development teams associated with these 3 landscape conservation design case studies. Across the 3 case studies, I spoke with 50 potential and current end users of the planning products. And I also, in order to kind of ensure that I was getting a range of landscape conservation design efforts, I also spoke with 10 alternative landscape conservation coordinators. So a primary product of this work, which was funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service, was the development of a practitioner's guide. And I'm really excited to be able to kind of talk to you guys a bit about the content of this practitioner's guide, which will be available in the spring. It's peer-reviewed. It's been peer-reviewed both by our practitioner contact team and by a broad diversity of landscape conservation coordinators. And so this guide contains a variety of insights associated that can help kind of provide insight into how to include human dimensions thinking and how to include local stakeholders and social data in the collaborative landscape conservation planning process. First, it speaks about local stakeholders' preferences regarding participation in these planning processes. I was able to kind of ascertain themes and people's preferences and provide some guidance on that. I then talk about basically the challenges associated with lack of stakeholder participation. And in order to do this, I looked at how lack of stakeholder participation impacted good governance practices that I spoke about before, like inclusivity, fairness, equitability, transparency, forward thinking. I then delved into kind of best practice recommendations or guidance associated with including local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning. And finally, we present provide some insight into how to find and collect social data that could inform landscape conservation planning processes. And in the guide, we also include an appendix that has a broad range of questions that can be administered qualitatively through interviews or quantitatively through surveys that can help development teams of landscape conservation planning efforts really delve into the interests and needs and priorities of end users of their planning products. Today, for the remainder of our discussion, I would like to focus on the best practice recommendations or guidance that we offer in the guide. So in order to kind of break down we basically developed and presented the guidance that we have in this guide, we looked at the landscape conservation planning process and we broke it down into these 6 fundamental stages. And these stages are informed by systematic conservation planning, a range of other landscape planning and conservation planning models, and as well as open standards for conservation and strategic habitat conservation. And so just to explain what these stages are, there's first the conceptualization of the landscape planning initiative. This is where basically why the landscape initiative is being implemented and how it's going to function and who it involves. Next, it's established. We look at the establishment of conservation goals and objectives. Third, we look at how the planning products are determined and developed. Then we look at how the planning products are distributed and their adoption promoted. We then look at how the human dimensions aspects of monitoring adoption. And then ideally, because landscape conservation planning is intended to be an iteratively adaptive model of planning, we look at the adaptive adaptation of planning products and processes. So I'll just go through each of these stages of the planning process and just speak with you a bit about how the human dimensions can be highlighted, how they can be focused on, how local stakeholders can be engaged. So first, during the conceptualization of the landscape conservation effort, there ideally is a development of a broad planning purpose. And the planning purpose sort of, develops parameters for the focus of the initiative. And the importance of developing a broad planning purpose is that a narrow planning purpose can sometimes preclude relevant stakeholders from engaging and participating in planning because they don't think it has relevance to them. For example, one landscape conservation initiative that I focused on looked at, had a priority of coastal wetland restoration. And so when I talked to some folks that were city planners in the area, they said that they weren't really sure how and if this planning process would be relevant to them because a lot of their shorelines are hardened. And so ultimately, it was very clear to the other folks that I talked to that engaging cities and urban centers in this planning process would be extremely important because this landscape conservation design, which was in Michigan, had a high density of human populations, especially in coastal areas. And so if there is a potential for really creating a broad planning purpose that doesn't preclude folks and gives folks the flexibility to really identify conservation goals and objectives that would serve their interests, that can really help enhance the likelihood that you'll get folks involved in the planning process at the local level. when determining the landscape boundaries, there's this sort of interesting phenomenon that comes about. So a lot of landscape conservation initiatives will develop their boundaries around an ecologically defined region, right? Around a species range, around an ecosystem extent. But the thing is that people don't necessarily have an emotional or intellectual connection to that landscape. For example, one of the case studies I did was in the Green River Basin, out where you guys are. And one of the things that I discovered through talking to end users was, and this happened in multiple case studies that I looked at, people didn't really necessarily have an emotional or intellectual connection to that entirety of that huge landscape. And so looking at questions of sense of place, meaning the functional, emotional, and intellectual connection that people have with places and resources within a place, can be really important for facilitating engagement. Focusing, if a landscape is defined by an ecological variable and you want to keep it that way, what could be done is that it could be broken down into socially meaningful subgeographies. And within those subgeographies, folks might have a higher likelihood of being engaged and interested in being engaged in a planning process. So in the Hudson River Valley Estuary Program, one of the, whose coordinator is one of the folks that I talked to, she said that there was a really high level of local stakeholder engagement in that initiative because people were really devoted and had a very strong sense of identity associated with the landscape. And they were really interested in helping sustain its social ecological integrity. And so finding out where within a landscape and what within a landscape people have an intellectual and emotional connection to can be really important for facilitating participation opportunities that are likely to really engage and promote engagement at the local level. Another thing that can be very early, ideally done in a landscape planning initiative, is to understand what types of capacity there is at the local level for implementing management actions. So you can look at what types of social networks are there that are focused on ecological or conservation-focused interests, and what types of initiatives are already ongoing. And it's really important to first understand that capacity, because if the capacity is not in place to implement management actions, that capacity has to be built. And that building process is it's a function of really a consensus-based decision process, relationship development, bringing people together to really foment a social network that can ultimately result in management implementation in contiguous lands. And considering what types of ongoing initiatives is also extremely important, because there's a high potential for duplication of effort, and a high likelihood and a potential for, if these folks aren't included in planning processes, or they're overlooked, or they feel snubbed, they can be offended, right? And so ongoing initiatives that were already in place, that might encapsulate, might be happening in a portion of the landscape, if they're not included, they can get offended. And so not only is it a function of really trying to maximize benefit by drawing on the institutional knowledge and local capacity and networks of those ongoing initiatives, you really don't want to duplicate effort and offend folks. So just a word to the wise. One of the ways that you can really start to understand more about the social and economic and political aspects of a landscape is through conducting a situation assessment. And a situation assessment basically helps you understand the current and historic condition of economic, social, ecological conditions within a landscape. These can be conducted through literature review. You can read newspapers to understand what's going on in the landscape, or you can read peer-reviewed articles. You can also talk to key informants. And doing a situation analysis is really important because it can help the developers of landscape conservation planning efforts understand the realm of possible considerations that they might have to take into consideration when they're developing a planning product and a planning process. So, understanding what the primary economic drivers are in a landscape can be really imperative for developing sociopolitically feasible and likely to be adopted planning products and conservation goals. Doing a situation assessment can also highlight and help identify local stakeholders within a landscape that should and might be included in the planning process. And so kind of identifying local stakeholders starts by understanding the boundaries of your landscape and the kind of resources upon which you're going to focus. And so then based on those identifications, you can understand what types of stakeholders influence adoption and management and might either help promote or preclude pro-conservation activities. And so those folks that really have that power and would be the end users of planning products are really important to include in the planning process, and also ideally on the development team. So development teams are the group of folks that have agreed to participate in a regular fashion in the development of landscape conservation planning products. And it's really potentially very important to include local stakeholder representatives. Obviously, you can't bring everybody to the table every single time you meet. It just leads to a really chaotic process, right? But if you're able to find representatives of interest groups at the local level, so representatives that might represent, for example, timber production or energy, or might represent soil and water conservation districts, having a trusted representative there at the table can ensure the interests and values of local stakeholders are consistently considered and integrated into the planning process and the planning products. And one way that you can identify these development teams is through social network analysis. Social network analysis can help identify significant nodes or the people that a lot of folks are connected to, and a lot of folks trust to represent their interests. So social network analysis followed up with a process of kind of vetting and ground truthing can really help identify those representatives. It's really important also not to assume who those representatives are, because sometimes those assumptions may not be accurate, and the folks that are at the table might not actually be representing the interests of the stakeholder groups that you're seeking to have representation for. Another really important thing to do early on is to communicate about the initiative early. So our research found that local stakeholders were much more likely to want to participate in landscape planning processes if they already knew that the initiative was happening prior to being invited to participate. Because sometimes folks would feel blindsided, for example, if they didn't feel like they knew about the initiative, and suddenly, like, this upstart initiative is asking them to participate, and who are they? So communicating early using a compelling narrative that ideally is targeted to different stakeholder groups can really help. And developing a communications team early on can really help with that targeting and that consistent communication. A little nod to Mary, who is the communication specialist for the Great Northern. So you can also, it's also really important to consult with end users regarding their preferences for participation. A lot of times there are logistical or technical or work-related challenges to local stakeholders attending a meeting or even a webinar. And so it's really important to early on understand what the local stakeholders' preferences are for participation. A lot of the time, my experience is that landscape conservation design teams, for example, meet during work days. And that might really preclude a lot of stakeholders from coming to the table because they can't get out of their work, the work that they attend every day. And they can't do that certainly voluntarily. There's also certain times of the year, such as during construction or harvest season, where local stakeholders will be less likely to be available. So understanding a bit about those preferences can really help. And it can also potentially reduce the likelihood of participation fatigue, right? And so participation fatigue is where people just get sick of it. They don't want to hear from you. They're either avoiding your emails or avoiding participation because you haven't kind of gone about asking for their participation in ways that are conducive to their interests and needs. So understanding those preferences for participation are really paramount. So during the establishment of conservation goals and objectives, conducting a needs assessment can be extremely helpful. So I talked before about situation assessments, which are sort of like an understanding of the historic and current conditions of the social, ecological, and economic conditions, right? A needs assessment is different. Needs assessments are ways to understand local stakeholders and ideally end users of planning products understand their needs related to the work that they do regarding land and resource use and management, their conceptualization of what would be an ideal state for the future, and understanding what those local stakeholders really need to better perform their job or maximize the potential for achieving a desired future condition. So these needs assessments are a really terrific opportunity to understand more about the work that local stakeholders do and to understand their needs related to that work. For example, one of the case studies that I focused on did a workshop very early on where they really sought to understand the needs of their local stakeholders. And as a result of that, they were flexible and understanding enough to modify their determination of what their planning products would be in order to suit the needs and interests of the local stakeholders. And that really produces a much higher likelihood of planning product adoption. Understanding and creating a space where local stakeholders' needs and interests can be communicated to development teams is also highly respectful, right? People like to talk about themselves, and people like to talk about their interests and needs. And so creating a space where it's not just about local stakeholders coming to participate in a predetermined process in which they're a very small piece in a larger machine, as opposed to focusing on their needs and starting with those needs in the best way possible, to the degree possible, in order to also meet the ecological objectives of a landscape conservation initiative can be really important. Some really fabulous ways that I've seen local stakeholders' interests and needs represented and articulated during landscape planning processes are through participatory mapping and scenario planning. Participatory mapping is a process where stakeholders come together and they actually develop geospatially referenced maps in some cases, or some type of articulation of where they value and what resources they value within a landscape, whether it be for recreation, for biodiversity protection, for resource extraction, just understanding where in a landscape local stakeholders have interests and values can help the development process proceed in a way that the objectives and goals that are ultimately determined have a high likelihood of sociopolitical feasibility, and they don't just contradict or really confront values and interests of local stakeholders. The Forest Service, for example, has used some participatory mapping in their management planning processes to some great success. Scenario planning is a process where there's actually an articulation, like a narrative, developed to understand the trade-offs and benefits associated with different types of management procedures. And since landscape conservation planning can be a sort of an abstract process, this is a really great way to sort of ground the process and give people a concrete understanding of, okay, if we choose X, Z will happen. If we choose Y, P will happen, right? And so it can really facilitate a dialogue where, as a result of the scenario planning, there's best practice, there are conservation goals and objectives developed that have a high likelihood, of sociopolitical feasibility. Another thing that is really important to do after every engagement effort where local stakeholders come to the table and participate and contribute is to follow up with those participants. Tell them how, first of all, thank them for their participation. You know, they oftentimes are volunteering their time. Acknowledging that you recognize that the time that they've invested can be incredibly important to retaining these stakeholders in the future. It's also really important to let them know how their input is being integrated into the conservation decisions that are being made. Because folks, when they see that they've devoted this time, often voluntarily, to a planning process, and their input isn't integrated, or there isn't a justification for why their input wasn't integrated into the planning outcomes, can really degrade interest and participation in the future. So maintaining these open lines of communication, following up with folks about, to thank them, to tell them what the outcome of the planning process was, to tell them about how their input was incorporated is really valuable. When determining the planning products, it really seems like going back to these needs assessments can be really valuable, because those needs assessments, which articulate what end users would really need to achieve their goals, and finding a balance between the objectives of the landscape conservation effort and the needs of the stakeholders, can be extremely valuable for promoting the likelihood of adoption of those planning products into local management actions. And so development teams can start with these needs assessments in order to sort of narrow the types of products that they might develop. And then it's really important to iteratively inform the form and function of the planning products based on end users. And so one of the best practices that I saw was there were prototypes of the planning products developed, and then there were explicit efforts to go back to the end users to say, is this what you need? Is this usable? Is it useful? And in that process, provide training on how to use the planning products, and then facilitate an opportunity for feedback. And if local stakeholders have been involved in the process since the beginning, there's a high likelihood that there's not going to be a need for a major overhaul of those planning products. So another reason to engage folks from the beginning is that ultimately what development teams really don't want to see is, oh, well, you have to change the whole product. If you're including local stakeholders throughout the process, throughout the decision process, throughout the refinement process, there's a high likelihood that the planning products will not have to be altered in an extreme way. Another way to really promote the likelihood of implementation and the likelihood that end users are considered throughout the planning process is to develop a implementation strategy. And this is an articulation of how the conservation goals might be met through local management practices. And it really encourages development teams to understand, to articulate who the end users are, and focus on those end users throughout the process. During the distribution of planning products, it's really important to, first of all, target communications about the availability of planning products to specific user groups. Targeted communications can really help highlight the relevance of the planning products to specific groups, and also ensure that it's not just a blast email that's sent out to everybody in such a way that might kind of dissuade people from being engaged because they might think it's not targeted to them. So targeting can be really important. Another thing that's really important is that even if folks want to adopt your planning products and they want to help meet these landscape conservation goals, they might face financial barriers to implementing management actions based on management plans they might develop. This is something that I saw with a lot of land trusts, for example. Land trusts operate on a funding by funding basis. And so acknowledging and addressing these financial barriers to adoption can be really important for promoting implementation. And, by addressing, I don't mean that it can either be that the landscape conservation planning process provides a granting opportunity. They can partner with a granting organization. They can even highlight and distribute information about what types of granting opportunities are out there. So it can either be, it doesn't always have to be the initiative forking over money. It can be even just assisting with the technical aspects, finding money, helping folks at the local level write grants or go through some complicated processes to apply for funding through programs like Natural Resources Conservation Services EQIP program. So, really addressing and acknowledging those barriers to adoption can be instrumental. Another way to promote adoption is through using demonstration sites. And demonstration sites are where there has been actual implementation of management practices that are based or are informed by conservation planning products. The Natural Resources Conservation Service uses demonstration sites a lot to help farmers understand how other farmers are implementing management practices. And it can be this peer-to-peer communication that's facilitated through demonstration sites can be really important because folks might be fearful about implementing management strategies. For example, in the South Atlantic LCC, there have been demonstration sites developed to inform folks about the benefits associated with controlled burns. And so controlled burns can be scary to folks. They might not want to burn their property. But if they're able to talk to their colleagues, their friends, their neighbors about how that management practice has served the interests of their resource use and their management, it can really help promote adoption. Another really important stage is this monitoring of adoption. So first of all, you want to know if your planning products are being used. And this can be done through requiring that folks, even if they access freely available landscape planning products through websites, provide their address, their email address. And you can follow up with these folks to understand, are they using them? How are they? Are they working? Are they usable? Are they useful? How could they be modified? And so since landscape conservation planning is supposed to be an iteratively adaptive process, understanding whether planning products are being adopted is instrumental, because if planning products are not being adopted, then the whole plan just sort of goes on the shelf, and it was not a wasted effort, but it didn't live up to its potential as a conservation process. And so soliciting feedback to inform product refinement and planning product adaptation can be really important. And finally, this last stage of the planning process, like any adaptive management or planning process, looks at adaptation of the planning products and processes. And so there ideally should be iterative development and adaptation of planning products and the planning process based on end users' feedback and analysis of changing social and ecological conditions. And a really interesting thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes planning products are developed by contractors. And so ensuring that there are opportunities to refine and modify planning products over time is really instrumental. So ensuring that, it's not just a product that's developed and then it goes on a shelf potentially, or just kind of exists and can't be adapted over time is really important. So those were just some highlights from the guide that we're developing. This practitioner's guide is intended to help reduce the likelihood of planning implementation gaps in collaborative landscape conservation planning, to help ensure the collaborative conservation planning process reflects good environmental governance. We should all be striving for that, and to promote the sustainability of this really promising conservation model. And with that, I'd just like to thank a few people that have been really helpful to my work. Of course, my interview participants, all 155 of them, without which this product could not have been developed. The Human Dimensions branch of the National Wildlife Refuge System, who funded this research. My practitioner contact team, who provided peer review and guidance on the development of the guide. My academic advisory committee, who helped with the theoretical foundation of the guide and my dissertation research in general. And also the Human Dimensions Research Unit of Cornell University, who's been involved in this process and this project since inception. And with that, I'd love to open up the floor to discussion and questions.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. It was a very informative outline for the guide, as well as what kind of led up to it in terms of your study. We do have a couple questions in the queue, so I will get started on those. The first question is, well, actually, a couple of people asked about this, about sharing a copy of the guide when it becomes available. Is it going to be available digitally? Is it something that I could get a link to and share with everybody on this webinar today?
Absolutely. The guide it's going through its last round of peer review, and it will be available in the spring, and it'll be available as a PDF that will be online. And hopefully we're talking about strategies for incorporating it into a website as well.
Oh, okay. That sounds wonderful. Yeah, if you could keep us posted on that, and then we can communicate that information to folks on the webinar, it'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, too, if there's going to be a PowerPoint. Will there be a copy of the PowerPoint and the guide? So we answered the guide. It'll be available. And then I told at the beginning of this webinar that I will send everybody a link to this recording as well as the slides. So you'll be getting that in a couple of days.
Great. And anybody who wants to follow up with me, I'm happy to have conversations with you or respond to emails or anything like that.
Yeah, great. The next question is, did you find that practitioners' participation was affected by previous planning processes that did not result in the promises or change they were told?
That is a spot-on question. I definitely did. Not only were people dissuaded from participating and partnering, but they also, even within initiatives, if they didn't see that there was a high impact of the planning process, so one of the landscape conservation initiatives that I studied had already, I sat in on 2 years of the planning process, and by the time I was conducting my interviews, the process had sort of terminated or had come up with its final product. And there was a lot of concern about, were these products being adopted and whether folks would actually want to be involved in iterative development, because it was so time consuming and it might not have been producing the expected benefit, like that joint production of goods that comes about with collaboration.
Thank you. The next question is, how does politics affect stakeholder participation? Willingness for politicians, decision makers to adopt stakeholder recommendations?
That's an interesting question. I mean, politics in general influence a lot of, they influence the funding streams available for, everything from management implementation to to funding for things like landscape conservation cooperatives. But what I think is a real significant benefit of local stakeholder participation is that politicians often want to represent the interests of their stakeholders. And if stakeholders have a sense of ownership and they've been involved in the development of these planning products and the conservation goals and objectives, there's a reduced likelihood that there would be basically political opposition to implementation. So that's really why it's very important to make this an inclusive, transparent process, because there's a higher likelihood that everybody who would be involved, including local politicians and national politicians, would object to it. I mean, for example, just to draw on an example, national heritage areas are oftentimes in presidential budgets, like their budgets are cut. But national heritage areas are extremely popular at the local level. They really promote economic vitality, and they're really supported by Congress. So even though the budget may be reduced annually, Congress keeps on funding them because they do produce benefit at the local level.
Thanks. Okay, this is two parts to this. Based on your experience, whose responsibility is it to do what I would consider to be pre-work? That, for example, consider ongoing initiatives, conduct initial assessment, etc. Obviously, drawing upon local knowledge via key informants, one or two people, will help identify local stakeholders, but these things take time. And this person is wondering if you've seen state or federal agency representatives use MOUs, and if so, were they successful?
Well, to address the first part of that question, it's a really good one. It's a kind of a chicken or an egg issue. What I've seen work really well is a small development team coming together with, not everybody on the development team is going to be there initially, because some folks on the development team are ideally identified through the process of situation assessments. But if you have some core stakeholder, core kind of leaders of the development team who come together, and then what I've seen as a best practice is they seek to understand the realm of possibilities and what exists already. So in the Great Lakes Coastal Wetlands landscape conservation design, for example, a small group of folks came together as part of a development team, and then they analyzed over 60 wetland management plans that were already in existence. And they, based on those, developed a very long list of potential targets for the conservation initiative. And then they invited stakeholders to come in and help them refine that list of potential targets. And so you can start with a small development team of devoted people, and then having a willingness to expand development teams to ensure that you get local stakeholder representation is really important. But it really does start with that champion who's willing to move the process forward and seek to understand the social and ecological landscape in the first place.
Thanks. Next question. Sometimes plans are initiated by NGOs and then face implementation barriers. Did you encounter this in your research?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I saw, a lot of these barriers have to do with financing, quite honestly. Every single land trust I talk to, and I talk to land trusts that are associated with, with interest groups such as Cattlemen's Association, agricultural groups, and land trusts that are just devoted to, say, forest conservation. Every single one of them said that they face the barrier of finances, basically, because they can acquire conservation easements, but they need money to do so. And so really helping address these financial barriers and not just assuming conservation will be implemented if people like the planning products or the conservation goals is really instrumental. And addressing, one of the recommendations that I saw that was great was, even if the conservation planning process doesn't have money to provide for implementation, they can help identify who does have money for implementation. And even just like walking folks through that, as I mentioned, the kind of technical aspects of applying for funding, which can be quite complicated, is really important. And so I have seen, NGO-led initiatives that have not been implemented, but I've also seen federally led initiatives that have not been implemented.
Thanks. Next question. You talked a lot about including local stakeholders who are part of implementation, but what are your thoughts about places to include local stakeholders who are not part of the implementation but are affected by conservation planning outcomes? Examples include recreational users, tourism industry, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is that I would actually consider those folks part of the end user group. I mean, there's like this interesting question of ideally anything, there's this concept of public trust, right? The resources that are administered by federal and state agencies are within the public realm. And there is an obligation of those trust administrators, those administrators of the public trust, to understand the interests and values of current and ideally future generations. And so general public participation is really important in conservation planning. And there can be things like workshops or town halls that are facilitated to include that, broad diversity of folks. A lot of times, recreation groups, for example, there are a lot of the folks that are involved in conservation and in administration of management action. So you've got, so to take an example, the Appalachian Trail, right, is managed by a cooperative partnership between private and NGOs and the federal government. It's focused on recreation. A lot of it is focused on recreation. And there are recreation groups that come and manage the trails. And including those folks in the decision process is really important because understanding how lands are used and prioritized is part of that planning process. So I wouldn't say that, there's a strict kind of cutoff between who is impacted and who is managing, because a lot of the time the end users are also the folks that would be undermining whether or not management actions are implemented. And so, it really is important to include everybody. I think that for the purpose of basically maximizing the efficiency and the effectiveness of the planning process, those end users might be prioritized, but creating opportunities for general stakeholders and even the general public to participate is also really important. It's doing something a bit more than the kind of the environmental, NEPA process where folks can write in, and where there's a more dialogue-based opportunity for discussion can be really helpful.
Great, thanks. Given that many stakeholders approach a landscape from a very different or even opposing perspective, how do you avoid least common denominator planning products?
That's interesting. Well, I'm not completely sure what a least common denominator planning product would be, but one of the kind of the sage advice that I learned from the Blackfoot Challenge out in Montana was that they really focus on the 80-20 rule, which is that folks in the room that come together around planning efforts focus on the 80% that they agree on, and they leave the 20% they don't agree on outside the discussion, at least for the time being. And while I'm not completely sure what a least common denominator would be, but a way to find common interest between highly disparate groups is to focus on superordinate goals, right? The goals that are above the current conflict. What are your basic interests? So industry, farming, recreation, natural resource management, and wildlife management might have very different interests, but clean water and clean air are everybody's priorities, because there's either regulations that that require them to comply with clean water and clean air regulations, or because those clean water and clean air are imperative for the resources that they value and that they grow. And so once those superordinate goals are determined, like the sustainability of access to clean water, that's the way to move forward. And it's not really a least common denominator, it's really just a superordinate denominator. So I think, I'm not completely sure if that addresses the question. I think that's like a whole nother dissertation, honestly. But I think about that a lot.
Thanks. Any advice for those who didn't communicate early and were well down the road when they find they need to check in with end users or the public?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My recommendation would basically be to, at the stage at which you start communicating, be really transparent. Tell folks about what you've done, how decisions have been made, who's been involved, what interests have been represented. Because even if folks weren't included, if they understand explicitly how decisions were made, they might be less wary of the planning effort and the planning products. And really, kind of promoting transparency is always a good idea. But the initiatives that I saw that kind of were a little bit rocky were ones where, folks were just like suddenly invited. They got a paragraph about the initiative, and they're like, please comment on our planning product. And folks were like, I don't even know what this planning product is. Folks are much more likely to trust planning products if they understand who developed them and what data was used. So maximizing transparency is a really good way to go forward.
Kind of a theme through a couple of these questions about talking about the political barriers, like for NGOs in terms of implementation, as well as, spanning governments and political jurisdictions. Do you have any advice on or resources to how people can start thinking about that and address that to be more successful in their work?
Yeah, I mean, what I think is a really good way to move forward is to identify groups, especially at the local level, that have a regional presence or have a transboundary presence. So soil and water conservation districts obviously exist within counties, or like they might be two counties that have one soil and water conservation district. But there's also national associations of water and soil and water conservation districts. And so finding the entities that cross those boundaries and working with them can be really helpful for moving forward. Also identifying what types of issues exist at the local level that are acknowledged to be transboundary issues, and identifying them as such, and starting a dialogue about the fact that your downstream pollution is caused by these upstream decisions can help kind of erode that hesitancy of working across boundaries. Working with the federal government and with NGOs that have a transboundary presence can be really helpful, because they already have that jurisdictional capacity. And so I definitely absolutely understand, an issue that some states face, for example, of having to prioritize work within their own counties. But if there's an opportunity for identify what resources are transboundary, what management issues are transboundary, what ecological threats are transboundary, and focus on those, and really try to play them up in the dialogue that initiates conservation planning processes, can really help focus, expand the focus within reason to be more landscape level as opposed to within strict social political boundaries.
Great. We do have a handful more questions, but given that it's we're on the hour, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. For those of you who asked questions that didn't get answered, I'm going to send those questions to Catherine with your email, and so she can respond to those. And as she said, You're welcome to contact her if people have more questions. Catherine, is there anything you'd like to add in closing?
No, I'm really excited to chat with folks. I also hopefully am going to be in federal employment before too long when I graduate from my degree program. So yeah, I'm really happy to talk to anybody that would like to chat.
Excellent. Yeah, and folks, as I said earlier, you'll get an email with the recording, a link to the recording, the slides, as well as Catherine's contact information. I'll actually have that to you in a week. So I just want to thank Catherine for presenting today, and I'd also like to thank our audience for attending the webinar. And just want to wish everybody a good day, and hopefully we'll see you. We have another webinar planned in February, but we'll be in touch with you regarding that topic and exact date. So farewell, everybody.